Hi everyone, my name's Lane McGlesson, and in today's video I want to share with you 5 essential watercolor techniques for beginners. The paper I'm going to use today is Arches 100% cotton paper. This is 300 pound and it's a cold press paper. Reason why I like using cold press paper is it gives a nice texture, if you can see that here in the camera, and compared to hot press, to be able to give some variety here to your picture. The brushes is I have a couple of large and medium round brushes, and then I have a couple of detail brushes for finish work working through. These are all synthetic, which I really like. They're a little bit springy and they do a great job when it comes through my watercolor painting. For the pigments, I'm going to be using this professional pigment palette that I have. And then the last thing I recommend is having 2 glasses of water. The reason why 2 is important is one is for rinsing out your brush, and the second one is for rinsing it out to make sure that it's completely clean. The 5 techniques is wet on wet, wet on dry, glazing, also known as a layering process, and then the final 2 are charging and dragging. Wet on wet is one of the most magical watercolor techniques because it allows the paint to move freely across the paper. To do this, you first apply clean water to your paper, creating a damp surface, and then drop pigment into that wet area. One pro tip to think of is if you're looking at your paper and it's shiny, you can see light shining off the water, then it's too wet. You need your paper to dry. What happens next is where the magic begins. The paint almost automatically blooms and spreads and bleeds and blends naturally. It creates wonderful soft edges and beautiful transitions that are nearly impossible to control completely. And that's actually the point. This technique is perfect for painting skies, sunsets, mist, clouds, and even in this particular case, a flower that might be in the background because it's more misty looking. It creates that dreamy watercolor look. People instantly can recognize that's created through watercolor. The key to success with wet on wet is learning your moisture control. As I mentioned earlier, if you can see a shine on your paper, it's too wet. Wet on dry is the opposite approach, and it gives you far more control than wet on wet. With this technique, you apply wet paint directly to dry paper. Because the surface isn't saturated, the paint stays much closer to where you place it, resulting in sharper edges. This is the technique you'll use when you're painting details like a tree branch or an architectural lines or maybe even facial features or the distinct outline of the petals of this flower. This is really the technique you want to use for any area that requires precision. Wet on dry is excellent for building structure into painting. It helps establish clear focal points and contrast against the softer wet on wet areas. The challenge here is confidence. Since the paint stays put, every brush stroke is more visible. That means deliberate brush placement matters. The previous technique with wet on wet is very loose and expressive. Think of wet on dry as more intentional and controlled. Glazing is all about layering transparent washes to create depth, richness, and complexity. To glaze, you apply one transparent layer of watercolor, let it dry completely, and then paint another transparent layer over the top of it. Because watercolor is naturally transparent, each layer shines through the next, creating that luminous color effect you simply can't achieve by mixing everything at once. For example, layering these petals on the flowers on top of each other's creates a natural shadow because of the overlapping technique. And because of that, it can create that subtle color shifts in that atmospheric depth. With layering or glazing, you can do it with many different colors as well. So for an example, if you wanted to layer a yellow and a blue on top of each other, they will naturally create a green. And that can be done without having to mix green as a pigment. Glazing is what gives many professional watercolor paintings that glow and that dimensional quality. One thing to keep in mind with glazing is you have to be patient. If you don't wait for the layers to completely dry, then they will naturally mix together on your page. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, remember to be patient in that process. The next technique is called charging, or I often like to call it bleeding technique. Charging is one of watercolor's most exciting techniques. It involves dropping additional pigment into the already wet wash while the paint is still active on the paper. This allows the colors to merge directly on the surface, creating beautiful organic blends and unexpected variations. So for an example, with this flower, I was charging 3 colors together. I started with rose red, and I charged magenta and orange into those petals. If you see how they naturally blend together in that sharp shape, it helps it to create a more realistic looking petal. As well, if you notice the stem had a little bit of a bleeding technique or charging technique into that lower petal. It's one of my favorite techniques. One thing to keep in mind, the trick is timing. If the paper is too wet, the colors will explode uncontrollably. If it's too dry, then the new colors create harsh edges. But if you practice and done right, charging adds life and excitement to your painting. Dragging is a process of loading up your brush with clean water and touching thick pigment that's already on your page. When the clean water touches this pigment, it will activate this pigment and it will spread or bleed into the water that's on the page. So to do this, you want to load your brush with water, clean water, and then drag it up to the pigment that is on the page. As that pigment activates, it will bleed in to the other areas the water has already touched. This raised texture of paper will actually catch the water and pigment and create these wonderful shapes. This technique is fantastic for suggesting rough surfaces. Dragging adds realism and character because it will mimic what you see out in nature, those things that aren't, regular. The secret is you want to use the right amount of clean water. If you use too much water, it will simply create a wet on dry look. If you use the correct amount, you can capture the difference of the bleeding between the darkest value of your pigment into the lightest area of your pigment. Dragging is one of the easiest ways to instantly make painting feel more dynamic and tactile. And now it's up to you. It's your turn to practice these 5 essential techniques so you can see your watercolor progress improve as well. Thanks again for watching. See you on the next video.